All right, everyone. Thank you for being here again. It's great to see all of you, all the returning faces and some new ones as well. How were your dreams last night? Yeah, I had a dream last night that was actually very relevant to this lecture today, which is kind of cool. So, what we're going to be going over today is the work of three different, you could call them clinicians or theorists / traditions, because we're going to be starting off with the work of Dr. Stanislov Grof. For those of you that are not familiar with his work, Dr. Stanislov Grof was one of the premier psychiatrists doing psychedelic work prior to psychedelics becoming illegal in 1971. In fact, he was able to carry on psychedelic work until about 1974. And during that time, he either personally supervised or indirectly supervised over 4,000 LSD psychotherapy sessions. And what's really extraordinary about that is that that's not only an extraordinary volume of sessions, but each one of those sessions lasted about 12 hours. So it's quite a lot of data to bring together and formulate into a model, which we'll be talking about today. And we'll be discussing why his work is important and how it helps to expand our consciousness, how it helps to de-identify from our ego structure or from our samsaric cycle, or whatever you want to call that structure, and begin to move into broader levels of awareness, branching out of what Grof calls the ego or body-mind, and more into what Wilber, who we'll be discussing later, calls centauric consciousness, a very high-level integration of the ego, body-mind, and the higher self, and then expanding outwards even from there into supraordinate levels, or the supraconscious. And we'll end with a discussion of Vajrayana Buddhism, which is very concerned with the preparation during the lifetime for the moment of death. Dr. Grof had this idea of the universe being holographic. He called it the holographic universe. And what that means is that within every single part of the universe, within every single small part, every particle, if you will, there is a reflection of the entirety. And that is exemplified by the beautiful images that you see there, and I can tell from some of the looks in the crowd that this looks very familiar. That you can experience this kind of imagery and this kind of feeling, apart from just the visual that we're getting now, but you can also feel this, you can hear this in deep psychedelic states. And he uses this principle in the birth scenario, or the birth drama, because as we were discussing yesterday, we as a society have become very overly identified with consciousness as an element of the ego awareness, or as an awareness of ourselves. And because of this, we miss out on a lot of what actually constitutes us as individuals, as human beings, as physical incarnate bodies, but also as spiritual beings. And we also aren't really able to, there's some things that we do or have done historically that are very traumatizing and destructive to individuals. Because if it's a child, say, if it's an infant, we don't necessarily look at the infant and say that it's having an experience because its ego has not come online yet. It doesn't have the myelination of its neurons to process memory. It doesn't have enough of a sense of itself. It doesn't even have a differentiation between its own body and the world outside. It is totally mired first with its maternal environment with the womb, and then coming outside the womb, still very much in union, symbiosis with mom, and starting to branch out into the other members of the community. And eventually it'll learn to, it'll bite its blanket and it'll bite its hand, and it'll realize that there's a difference between biting an object and biting itself, and there will be a differentiation there. And as we continue to develop our experiences, we grow in even greater awareness of that. So we start out with being able to differentiate our body from outside, so self and other. And then we learn to identify with ourselves as a mental body, as a stream of thoughts and experiences and memories. And then hopefully learn to transcend that, bring in together the ego, the body, and then whatever lies beyond that, as we were discussing yesterday, the unconscious elements of ourselves, like our dreams, like nature, and actually kind of coming back full circle, where initially we differentiated self from other. Now we're coming back into a merging, or a more mature symbiosis of, is there really an outside and inside? Is there really a self and other? And this is why people like Carl Jung called this the self, the capital S self, versus the little s self of the ego. And so Dr. Grof is actually, he's a great example of this holographic paradigm. It's a wonderful image by Alex Gray. And we'll be discussing these 4 stages right here, the 4 stages of birth. Before we go there, coming back to not being able to say that the fetus or the infant is having an experience, we always think of it in terms of an ordeal for the mother, correct? Because, of course, the experience of childbirth is excruciating. It can be, right? And we never really conceive of what that experience might be for the infant, who is going through these various stages of being first contracted by the uterus with no way to escape, and then the cervix opening up, and the fetus being able to move through, but also being absolutely crushed by the birth canal. And having this experience not only of moving through the birth canal, but of a confrontation with death and a life and death struggle. And then, of course, once it is able to exit out, then it undergoes the birth or the rebirth experience. And we will play this out through various iterations in our lives. And what all psychologists try to do is to try to assign a causation. They'll try to look at early childhood experiences and say, like, oh, well, of course, like you're neurotic in this way. Look at how your mother treated you, or look at how your father abused you, that sort of thing. And we got to the point where, as a field, psychologists would say, well, yeah, of course, like you had these terrible experiences, or you had this certain kind of experience when you were nursing. But no one would ever consider what the actual birth experience was like. And this is what Grof is saying, is that there is actually an image-making aspect of the psyche that is continuous throughout all time, not through just the instantiation of individual beings. And what he found as he went deep with these people in deep psychedelic therapy, so he was using doses in between 150 and 600 micrograms of LSD, which is quite an extraordinary experience. And we'll be discussing a little bit about the pharmacology and what it is that psychedelics do. And in a short phrase, I could say that they open the aperture between the conscious and the unconscious, that distinction between self and other starts to fade, that the ego boundary disintegrates, and we come into direct union with exactly what it is that we are. And so, apart from assigning causation, he does this in a way to be able to work with process, but he's not saying, okay, so you got stuck in your mother's birth canal at this point, or you had your umbilical cord wrapped around your neck, and this is why you are the way you are. Because he's very much keeping in mind this holographic principle, which is that contained within that was a karmic element, something that you came into life and were incarnated to process. And there's also the fact of your ipso facto constitution as an individual. So you could have an identical birth experience to someone else. However, because you are a different individual, you're going to imprint or internalize that experience in a different way. And so he's not assigning causation, but rather is saying that there is a far deeper mystery to be had and to be glimpsed at than simply like, yeah, this happened, and yeah, that's why you are how you are. And what was very interesting about all of this too was that it seemed like there was no end to how deep they could go, because there would be certain biographical elements that would come up, certain things that happened within the individual's memory. There would be corollary experiences in the perinatal or the birth experience. And then even past that, there would be experiences that the individual could have had no biographical memory of. It was outside their lifetime, it was ages ago. A great example of that was a man who came in with psychosomatic pain in his shoulder. They could find nothing medically wrong with this man. And as they started to do his therapy, he remembered being shoved by like some kids on the playground and hurting his shoulder. He then remembered getting stuck behind his mother's pubic bone, right on that left shoulder. And then past that, he was riding a horse in some other lifetime in a colonial, or not medieval, but circa 1700s battle where he was shot through the shoulder. And that's where this distinction starts to become very blurry, and how do we make sense of all of this? Because it's not necessarily that that individual was that person and they died on that battlefield long ago. It just seems to be a kind of constellation within this person's psyche or their being that drew them to this particular experience. But the funny thing about it was, as soon as they go towards that transpersonal element, as soon as he experiences the deepest level, if you will, of being shot through his shoulder, the pain resolved, along with all of the neuroses and traumas around it. And so that's kind of the key here, is that it doesn't really seem to be that you need to assign causation, or you need to know what your past life was, or do a past life regression, or whatever it is. You just need to get to the deepest layer of what this was. And Grof refers to that as an element of condensed experience, or a system of condensed experience, these kind of various archetypes and constellations. And we won't be able to go too much into the astrological elements tonight, because I personally don't have expertise in that area. But Grof became very fascinated with this even in the mid-1980s. And he's become very good friends and colleagues with Richard Tarnas, who's very deep into that field and is very knowledgeable about that. And so this is also that element of, where is the line between all of this? If there's some sense, or if there's some way that we can make sense of our experience out of the alignment of planets and stars, then there's something that's happening between what's going on in here, between what's going on out there, even as far out as the solar system, yeah. But that's what we're going to be exploring tonight. And Grof, we're going to start out talking about him because he's an excellent example of the holographic paradigm, as we all are. So Dr. Grof did his training in post-World War II Czechoslovakia, very much steeped in the Freudian tradition and the medical model, and was also part of a communist country at the time, and was very much a straight kind of science guy, like I was. And when Albert Hofmann synthesized LSD-25 in 1947, and Sandoz began sending it out en masse in the early 1950s, because no one knew what to make of the substance. They were sending it out for, like, hey, psychiatrists, doctors, like, do stuff with this, please. Like, we don't know what to do with it. Literally shipping out, like, liter bottles of LSD-25. And so psychiatrists took to it. Initially, they called it a psychotomimetic, which means that it mimicked psychosis, so that they could understand their psychotic patients better. And then it kind of went through this evolution of, well, is that really what's happening? Does it make you psychotic? And eventually they settled on the name psychedelic through correspondences between, I know it was between Aldous Huxley and someone else. It was not Aldous Huxley that came up with that particular name, but the person he was corresponding with. And so as a psychiatrist in Czechoslovakia, a post-communist country, Stanislov Grof was having a lot of difficulty making sense of what was happening. People were having experiences that were described in all sorts of mystical traditions, in Gnostic Christianity, in Vajrayana Buddhism, in Hinduism. They were having unitive experiences of God. They weren't just experiencing biographical trauma as he'd been taught to look for as a Freudian psychologist. They were experiencing perinatal trauma. They were experiencing transpersonal trauma, ancestral trauma. And then they were identifying and experiencing oneness with the earth, with the plants, with all of life, with the universe itself. He ran into a lot of trouble with this because in communist countries, you could not speak of having mystical experiences. So fortunately, for all of us, he found his way over to the United States and started doing research at the Maryland Psychiatric Center, as well as the Esalen Institute in Big Sur, California. Which is just to say that he was very much steeped in the Newtonian Cartesian paradigm that we were discussing, which is that the past completely determines the future, that what we are is nothing more than an assemblage of molecules, and that you can change behavior or you can change people through the modulation of their chemistry, which led to some very inhumane treatments of psychiatric patients all throughout the 20th century. Yeah. So he divided the stages of pregnancy, or the stages of birth, into 4 different stages. And it's actually very closely, if not identically, mirrors the hero's journey. So you start out in a very comfortable spot. You're totally at one with the maternal environment, with the womb. And by extension, you are one with the universe. And now you can't have good and bad womb experiences. We'll explore that in a case later on. But for all intents and purposes, this is the unitive experience. The feeling of total oneness. And it's undifferentiated, which means the fetus doesn't really have a sense of itself throughout all of this. It's just experiencing all of it at the same time. In fact, I mean, when you see children when they're recently out of the womb, they look rather Buddha-like, especially when they're sleeping. And then there's a conflict that starts to happen, and this is the correlate with the hero's journey. So there's the comfortable known, there's home, but there's tension, there's conflict building in the kingdom. And the way forward is not yet clear. This is what is known as a no exit scenario, because it's just constricting. It's just pain, it's just whatever it is. And there doesn't seem to be any exit, there doesn't seem to be any hope. But then lo and behold, a light at the end of the tunnel opens, and now there's a way out. And this is the part of the hero's journey where the hero leaves home and goes out into the unknown. This is the ordeal, meeting with darkness, facing one's shadow. And through that ordeal, you could see here, right, the fetus's head being distended by the crushing forces of the birth canal. Thank God we have very flexible skulls when we're infants. So it's not altogether pleasant for mom. It's altogether not pleasant for the fetus either. And at this time, it's very much experiencing aggression. It's experiencing sexual contact with its mother. genital contact, oral contact, and it may eventually come into contact with biological material, i.e. urine and feces on the other side, which we'll talk about later. And then there's the emergence, the rebirth, or the birth in this case. At which point the ordeal has been overcome, the life and death struggle won over. And this was one of the great contributions of Grof, was the child needs to be returned to the mother. Because the protocol for much of the 20th century was to, all right, mom's just been through something really harrowing. Now let's take the infant, let's swaddle it, and let's go put it in the nursery, away from its mother, which can lead to an incompletion with this process, a kind of insecurity around that. And so Grof, he ties various what we might call pathologies or disorders or whatever. I simply just like to refer to them as ways that we are. It's only a pathology if it causes us and others pain, yeah, which they often do. But he links certain psychoses and certain neuroses and certain conditions to each stage of this process and how people imprint or how they internalize each aspect of that experience. I'll discuss more of that later. But in the beginning, if you're sitting in a good womb, and this is very much dependent on how the world and mom are interacting, and this is another example of you are not just a separate, cut-off individual, because whatever is going on in the world, whatever is going on in the parental relationship, if there's any sort of stresses or things like that, that's going to correlate to an experience in the womb through both uterine constriction and also cytokine factors, or factors that are secreted via the fetus, inflammatory factors, things like that. And again, this is the unitive oneness experience, undifferentiated. Many mystical traditions will make the mistake of saying that the idea is to get back to this state of consciousness, to this unitive, undifferentiated state. But as Wilber is going to very much argue for, it's that there's no going back. There is no going back to being in the womb. There is only moving forward into greater consciousness of a differentiated unity, of knowing that, yes, we are this separate entity that I am, Michael, sitting up here talking to you, but that there is much more going on outside the surface. So this very much comes into play with any sort of world events that are happening, say like the occupation of European countries during World War II, or strife during communism, or Chairman Mao's disposition, or the war in Iraq, name it. So if there's things going on in the world, there's going to be a corollary experience happening for the fetus via the experience of the mother and via the experience of the family. This is a drawing from an individual's LSD psychotherapy session of a BPM-1 experience of unitive oneness. It's very oceanic, the deep waters. And as we're talking about yesterday, with regards to nature-based maps, the ocean is very much a symbol or an incarnation of the Great Mother, of these very, very deep, dark depths. It's where life on Earth began. And here life is beginning. So you kind of see this holographic nature starting to cement itself. Oceanic experience in the womb, a very salty solution, the amniotic sac. Just as we, as an entire collective of life, began as primordial bacteria in the ocean billions of years ago, each and every single one of us starts out as one cell in an amniotic fluid. How funny. And as I said, you can also have bad womb experiences where this environment very much turns persecutory and aggressive, but we'll get to that later. So, I've been saying BPM, forgive me please. These are the basic perinatal matrices. Grof uses very scientific language, had to, as someone trying to push a new paradigm into the world. So he uses basic perinatal matrices and systems of condensed experience, both of which are related but not the same. So this is when delivery is starting to happen, or when contractions are starting to happen. And all of these drawings that you're going to see are drawings of patients after their LSD psychotherapy sessions. So this is what someone actually experienced as they were going back through. And here's the cool thing, was that this is likely how they experienced it as they were an infant. It was just recorded in body memory and in energy and stored somewhere in the body, like the man with his shoulder, right? That trauma was held on to by his body for his consciousness to become more mature and expand so that those energies could be expressed. And what's more is when people go through their various stages of birth in these deep psychedelic sessions, their body starts to take on the physiology of whatever was going on at that time. So with this as an example, people actually might stop breathing. They might turn blue. They look like they're suffocating. They're actually re-experiencing in the moment. It's as if they brought that past moment forward into the now so that it could be re-experienced by a grander, more encompassing consciousness. And that seems to be what is healing. And why does this happen? None of us can really know. That's the kind of grand mystery of why we're all here. Many people have spoken about it. I most identify or draw the most use from the work of Ram Dass, who says that our souls came here to do certain work or to come to school in a way. That we took a separation from the unity that is God to be able to know God in a different way. And we'll talk about the deep, deep psychedelic experiences of experiencing the central archetype of the self, or the monad, that unitive awareness that permeates every single one of us. Whatever the reason is, it doesn't really seem to be like there is a reason or there's a causation behind it. It's just that it all is. And that the divine equally delights in play and torment in this world of duality. This is also taken from that same stage of birth, from the no exit scenario. Not being able to escape, it was experienced as a demonic entity attacking. Hell. It's very interesting, right? Because the Christian conception is that hell is eternal. There's no getting out. And Grof linked this to certain conditions, like what he called endogenous or inhibited depression, as opposed to agitated depression. Patients that have depression stemming from this part of the birth experience tend to be much more inhibited. They are more catatonic. They don't really move as much. They're very lethargic. And their fantasies and means of suicide are often a way to get back here. So he found that people that were experiencing depression from this phase, or from this side, or imprinted in this one particularly for whatever reason, they would tend to kill themselves by slitting their wrists in baths of warm water, taking heavy doses of barbiturates, going back to sleep. Whereas in the third perinatal matrix, this kind of depression would manifest more as agitated depression. And this was much more violent. They would be much harder on themselves, whereas the endogenous or the inhibited depression would just be kind of like morose and sad. This one would be very masochistic, very hateful towards the self. And their means of suicide would be more in the line of shooting themselves in the head, of jumping off buildings, things of that nature. And so when you're entering into this stage of the birth, where now you're going through the ordeal, now it's an actual life and death struggle. Before, there was nothing you could really do. There was no way out. You were getting squeezed. And it just felt like hell. Well, now the actual life force of the infant is being mobilized. Just as the butterfly, as it's emerging from the cocoon, must struggle to get free, or a goose from its egg, now the fetus is actually having to struggle and move its body and get through the tunnel and emerge out to the other side. So this is where all of our kind of experiences, our first experiences with our own aggression come from. Because we're experiencing the crushing forces of the vagina as it's pushing us out. And so how Grof theorized this with the experiences of his patients was that they were experiencing either tremendous aggression towards the forces that were crushing them, or they were internalizing these and turning that aggression inwards, which is depression. You take war to the self. You hurt yourself. I'm a piece of shit. In fact, I'm a piece of shit is very interesting as well, because this is where all of that starts to come through. This is a Norwegian painter by the name of Geiger. His ability to portray these elements are quite uncanny. And so there's this kind of like this almost like strange duality that you enter into, this kind of like blasphemous ordeal. It's where the sacred and the profane are being formed and where the two are kind of one. There's a kind of crucifixion that's happening. There's the contact with the sexual organs of the mother. And so all the sexual aggressive instincts are being mobilized. And so all of our kinks come from this particular stage. And there was also another interesting phenomenology, which was the witches' Sabbath. And this will also be explored in our case later on, where there's kind of like an unholy Sabbath happening. And this is all happening as the image-making part of the patient's psyche as they're re-experiencing their birth experiences. But as we know, people throughout time have also performed rites like this. Different pagan groups would actually mobilize these same energies from the psyche that we feel in our birth as collectives. And it's that same kind of like wrestling with duality of the sacred and the profane. I think I'll be able to explore that a little bit better when we do our case. But then, of course, there's the emergence past that, which is the birth. Now the ordeal has been done. If all goes well, infant is returned to mom almost immediately so they can feel her warmth and remember her heartbeat and know that it's her. Knowing that they could make it through this ordeal and that everything was going to be okay. And that they were going to be held. And now they've reached a new level. Previously, they were within the womb of Mother. And now they're out into the womb of Mother Earth. They have a degree of agency that they did not have before. And we continue to go through these different cycles as we mature. You gain more agency. The child is continuously going through these episodes of death and rebirth, especially in its formative years, as it starts to get a sense of its body, as it starts to be able to walk and move around, more agency. It's able to talk. Now it's able to command, to ask, to shout, to say no. It's a favorite word among 2-year-olds. And the idea is that we really never stop doing this. This really is the central kind of archetype that we go through, is at least in the dual realm, is that of death and rebirth. It's always going to be in the sense of increasing agency and decreasing suffering. And as you move into higher and higher stages of this, it gets to the point where it's not that you don't experience suffering, it's that you experience suffering in a different lens, in a different perspective. And there will be a rather beautiful and moving case of how that looks like in a partnership where one of the partners is dying. So the case that I want to share with you, and before I move on to that, I want to share the dream that I had last night because it's very indicative of all this. I'll tell it in the same style that I've asked you guys to tell your dreams in. I'm following an old man through a subterranean lair. With me is a young woman, short brown hair. I've never seen her before. And this old man is leading us through this underground lair. And we come to this pumping station. And there's streams of torrential water passing through. There's 3 of them. And before I can even realize what's happening, the old man dives into one of the torrents. And the woman follows after him. And I follow after her. And so I'm going through this long tube filled with water. It's not yet submerged yet, so I can still breathe. But it comes to a point where we go down, and now underwater. I'm underwater, and I'm swimming through, getting pushed through this long tunnel. And as I'm about to get to the very end, I get stuck. And I have to wiggle out. And then I emerge into this kind of sea of red. And don't know yet where the other 2 are. But those are very much, that's very much a BPM 3 level phenomenon, which I thought was interesting given the content of the lecture this evening. It's another example of the holographic universe that we're being set in. And there's a lot of cool, this is where most of our, I guess you could say, strife comes from, is from these 2 particular elements, because once we get past the ordeal and we're reborn, then our agency is increased, the ordeal's over, and we're great. But we can go unconscious when certain things like this are happening, which is a very normal thing to do. And so, anything left over from these particular experiences gets stored in the body for later processing. And you can, kind of like the art of Geiger here, you can tell different artists. I like to use Maynard James Keenan as an example because his lyrics are really, really rich in BPM 2 and 3 dynamics. There's the song Push It. I don't know if any of you are familiar, but its chorus goes like this. Still love me, push it in me, push it on me. It's also very good at playing with words. Shit on me, shit on me. Which is also a correlation to encountering feces post-birth and being mired in that. Stan Grof also tied that to different transpersonal elements of the Jews drowning in the latrine pits during the Holocaust. But you can kind of tell if there's certain elements that you're drawn to, if there's certain, because I've always known that particular artist's lyrics have always resonated with me in a very strong and visceral way. And the case that we're about to explore is my own. And all the psychedelic experiences I've had, all of the very deep psychological work that I've done have centered around these 2, BPM 2 and 3. And so about springtime last year, I went to Garner State Park, and I took 3.5 grams of mushrooms. And as the fire was roaring, and as the night was descending, and as I started to delve deep into the experience, behind my closed eyes, I was witnessing a scene very much like this. I was participating in an orgy. Not actually, I was just on my own in Garner State Park. But I was with all of these kind of like these tribal people. They all seemed very different from me. And I didn't really know what to do in this scenario. I'd never been in this situation before. So I was kind of at a loss. I was scared. I didn't know what to do. And all of those other elements, all those people that seemed very different from me, they started to look at me. And they started to snarl. And they started to grab me. And lo and behold, they hoisted me up on a cross. And then they gutted me open, and they pulled my intestines out. So again, we're seeing that same sort of like scatological, the pulling my shit out, right? Literally. And what's interesting about that is we've been discussing this kind of self and other dichotomy. These people were all very different from me. These are parts of myself I didn't identify with. And here I was in this orgy where everyone's having a great time except me, because I'm too high and mighty or whatever to identify with my goodness, to be able to participate in any meaningful way in this psychological orgy that's happening. And so they see me and they say, "You're too good." All right, Savior, why don't we string you up? And why don't we show you? Show you your shit. That was a beautiful one. And then as I went through that and as I allowed myself to be disemboweled and dismembered, there were two twin clouds that erupted up from the earth. This is with my eyes open. And they went up and circled the moon. And then I heard the words, Mysterium Conjunctionis, 3 times. Mysterium Conjunctionis, Mysterium Conjunctionis, which will be the topic of tomorrow night's lecture on alchemy. Because the Mysterium Conjunctionis is the outcome of the alchemical procedure. The mysterious joining of the opposites, like happened in that vision of mine, with the disparate parts of my psyche coming into union with me and showing me that I was the same. And this was another experience I had just recently, actually. It all kind of coincided with, we have been meeting and discussing Grof's work over the last few weeks. And this is an image taken from that book, Beyond the Brain. And this is an example of a bad womb experience. Of mom is going through some sort of trouble. She's been in an accident. She's been hurt. There's some sort of conflict or strife going on. And the fetus is experiencing this as pain, as suffering, as whatever this is. And I found it very interesting. I remembered that when I was 8 years old, around that age, we had these Halloween decorations that we would put up. And I would always ask for them to be put up in my room. They were a string of lights that were these eyes. They were menacing eyes, like this. They were very frightened. But it made my room look a lot like this. And I found it intensely comforting. I used to stare at them for hours. It was only after I saw this image and started to link that together that I realized that I was recreating what had become comfortable environment for me, because my mother was in anguish for much of the duration of her pregnancy with me. And so I learned to appreciate pain as home. And this is what I went into a weekend with a supervisor of mine. And what he had the facilitators do was to grip me really hard. He had 2 female facilitators grip me like this, squeeze me really hard and say things like, "My sweet baby, please don't leave me. I need you, I need you, I need you," things like that. And this brought upon an immediate, visceral, emotional reaction. I was terrified, I was crying, I was trying to push away, but it was also, I was caught in this. He realized this immediately and said, yeah, you could do this all day. Because this is home for him. He's learned how to enjoy it. And somehow, there was some resolution that happened. Having been able to go back to that experience, because I did experience that. Whenever they started to grip me and hold me, everything went black. I couldn't see anything. I could just feel everything gripping me, like my mother's womb must have been. And beyond that, I also saw these dead hands that were reaching up at me like this. They were saying, save us, save us. So I experienced not only the prenatal elements of that, but I experienced the transpersonal elements as well, dipping down into the hell realm. And we're going to start talking about the great theorist Ken Wilber. He's another Alex Gray. He's just great at drawing people, which is also going to segue into our discussion of Vajrayana Buddhism. Because the goal of all of this is to be able to expand and deepen our consciousness. Denial of nothing, like the warrior. And because there is no going back to the original situation, there is no going back to the womb, there is only moving forward as ourselves. Why did we take this form? Why are we who we are? As far as I can tell, it's because, well, look at all of you. There's never been a set of eyes. There's never been anything remotely like you before. And there never will be again. And it's a beautiful dance of the infinite playing with the finite. Because if we know how the game is going to go, if we are so identified and so connected to the grand unitive consciousness, that's not really very much fun, is it? Because you know what's coming. It's like a joke that you already know the punchline to. It just doesn't hit the same way. It's not going to make you bowl over laughing. It's not going to make you laugh from your belly. You'll be like, oh yeah, yeah. Nothing really that fun about that. However, when it's a surprise, and something that Alan Watts will talk a lot about too, is that you can actually take this to its extreme. You can start to hone your ability to visualize. And by honing your ability to visualize, you can experience anything you want to experience, especially if you learn how to awaken in your dreams. Then you can really viscerally experience anything you could ever want. You could play that out for years, and eventually you'll get sick of it all. So just imagine for a moment that you are God. You have the extraordinary power to manifest everything that you could ever want. How long will that keep you occupied? 2 days? 6 years? Rest of your life? Maybe. But eventually, you're going to look around and say, well, you know what would really be great is if there was a surprise button. And so you imagine the surprise button, and you hit the surprise button. And here you are. And here we all are. None of us ever guessed this one, eh? Look at the world that we're in. What we're able to do. What possibilities there are here in this moment. And so the work of this man, Ken Wilber, his grand endeavor was to link together basically everything that has ever been studied. So he's linked together not just Western empirical science, but mystical traditions of every order, Gnostic Christianity, Vajrayana Buddhism, Hinduism, Sufi Islam, any sort of mystical tradition, and looked at all of these cross-culturally. And he's developed a series of stages and states of consciousness. And the idea is that if you're able to assess where people are at in their development, then you can start to prescribe a set of practices or medicines or what have you to help them get to their successive stages and help them at each stage where they get stuck. Because the thing about each stage is that each new stage that you enter into or that you transcend into is going to resolve the issues of the previous stage that could not be resolved within that stage. But there are also going to be new issues that emerge as a result of coming to that new state or that new stage of consciousness. And that, as we were discussing yesterday, you don't do away with it. It's not like you throw away your infant consciousness or you throw away your child consciousness, right? We all have our inner children as well. You don't throw that state of yourself away. You grow over it and you include it. What we've colloquially referred to as transcluding or transcending and including. And by that means, you're able to grow in consciousness without abandoning any of the stages underneath. Because as we were talking about yesterday, we don't get to be where we're at today simply because, which is kind of funny because that's how the scientific paradigm has articulated it. Is that, oh, it's just chance. Human consciousness just emerged, and it was superior to everything. It's funny, right? Until it's destroying the world. And that's kind of where the joke's on us, because then if we don't come to recognize the various levels that we're built upon, those levels reach back up, i.e. Mother Earth, taking us back down into the womb, right, to reconsolidate and come up with a new plan of how to extend and deepen consciousness. So we have an opportunity as a species to be able to do that, to be able to transcend and include our rationality, because it is a gift. It is the highest of the angels in the Christian tradition, Lucifer, the light bringer. However, like Lucifer, it also got drunk on its own power and descended into hell, which we could be fast approaching if we continue to remain mired in this state of superiority, rather than appreciating all the levels that we sit upon, rather than understanding the incredible innate intelligence of the body and of nature. This is actually what Grof refers to it as the innate healing intelligence. And it was really lovely as we were discussing this, because as a psychologist, I'm very interested in what is healing to people. And what Grof said was that once you are able to get people comfortable enough, once they trust you enough, all you really need to evoke the deepest parts of themselves is deep and heavy breathing and evocative music, which a lot of us may know as the practice of holotropic breathwork, which of course Grof and his wife Christina started westernizing or bringing into the Western canon post-prohibition of psychedelics, which is a pretty badass thing for Grof to do, is say, well, if we can't do it with psychedelics, let's see them try to make breath illegal, and we'll still heal people. The only problem is that holotropic breathwork is not as certain, is not as powerful a medium. It's something that I practiced, and because of my own inhibitions and fears, I couldn't go as deep into it as I could have. But at the end of the day, right, maybe that would have been really traumatic to have gone to that place with LSD. Who knows? So yeah, we're going to be talking about Ken and his work, and also the journey that he went on with him and his wife Treya. But these might look kind of familiar, but it's a different way of thinking. This is called the 4 quadrants, and this is a way of organizing experience. So in every experience, there are facets of all of these elements. So here on the right side, you have the objective, the outside, the what can be studied and looked at. On the left side, you have the subjective. Above, you have the individual. Below, you have the collective. So here, you have subjective experience. My experience of myself as an individual, my thoughts, feelings, emotions, my mystical experiences, my conception of the world. Within all of that, by speaking, I'm activating different levels of my neocortex, my auditory cortex, different areas of my brain are firing. You cannot reduce any part of the phenomena to any one of these quadrants. They're all happening simultaneously. So in order for any of that to happen, there has to be a culture and a worldview. I'm speaking a language right now. And that does not emerge ipso facto out of myself. It's something that we all share. That's why we're able to gather here and I can communicate to you what I'm trying to communicate to you. So if that's the collective subjective, on the other side we have the collective objective. And so these are our social systems, these are our economic systems, these are our systems of government. Because again, the room that we're sitting in right now is partially funded by public funds. It's funded by capitalism, by our economic structure. And all of these are necessary. You can't reduce any single one of them. And this is the grand mistake that science makes, is it's all here. It's all an it. And there are people that will say that it's nothing more than the movement of molecules and atoms through a biological system. So that's important to understand, and then these are the different stages of development. So here you have stages, here you have states. What Wilber refers to as growing up and waking up. Now at each level, you can have any of these experiences. So say we're here at W1 archaic, so this is the fetus. The fetus is having a non-dual experience in the womb of mystical union with the universe and mother. But it's doing so at its undifferentiated state, which is all well and good. It's very appropriate to where it is. And then you have these different layers, these different stages. So we as a collective are somewhere right in here, in the rational pluralistic. And I'll describe what each of these means so that we can have a better understanding of that. So archaic is undifferentiated. This is the child starting to learn to differentiate itself from the environment. Not yet discerning that it and mom and dad are not yet separate entities. Because, again, if you try to put yourself in the image, or you put yourself in the experience of an infant, when an infant cries, mom and dad come. There's no, and this is all kind of conceptual, we can't really, it's hard to go back to that state unless you're really deep into LSD or any other medicine. Once you get past that, you get to the magic stage. And this is where we're starting to make sense of everything that's going on, but we're doing it in whatever way is coming to us. So we're walking around and we see the moon and we're saying, oh, the moon's following me. I must be doing that. Or when I'm hungry or when I don't want to do something, I just yell and throw myself on the floor and things magically happen. And so these are this is the most egocentric that you can be, because you can't even conceive of an other at this point. It's just you. But as you get into the mythic stage, this is where you're starting to externalize your sense of self to others based on shared values and culture. This is why we see all of the social dynamics that are at play in our adult world on the playground with children, where we see them enforcing gender roles, where we see them outcasting, because they're starting to be able to do this. It's not just them anymore. Now there's starting to emerge a we. And what's interesting about this too is that we go through these stages not only as individuals, but as a collective. Like we were talking about earlier, when we're starting out as a single cell in the womb, just as we were starting out as prokaryotic organisms in the primordial ocean, various stages of our societies also went through these stages. So there were individuals that were imbued or that were projected upon to have magical powers. These are the shamans and the leaders. And then as you move beyond that, there's the mythic, where those leaders are now deriving their power from a mythical deity or god. And like the children that are outcasting and enforcing gender roles on the playground, it's very ethnocentric, meaning to your own people, which means you do not describe the role of self to people that do not ascribe to your values. This is tribalism. This is warfare. This is otherization. This is, we don't know what their values are. We don't speak their language. Therefore, they are dangerous. And we've experienced this collectively as trauma, as either dominating or being dominated. But then a beautiful thing starts to happen is that you start to develop a rational perspective. And it's only at the rational perspective, like we were talking about, there's problems that emerge at each stage that cannot be solved at that level of development. But as you go above, those problems start to be resolved, and there's new ones that emerge. So with rational, now you're starting to really piece things together. And you're starting to understand that there's a link between all of you that transcends any mythic membership that you might have. That's why in our world we can coexist with people that have very different value systems. This is what the grand experiment of our nation was meant to be, was living harmoniously with people that are very different, that are different either in terms of their gross anatomy, which is kind of funny to say, right? But skin color, by values, by religion, and trying to create a new synthesis based on rational values. That, yeah, it doesn't really matter what people's values are as long as they're humanistic, as long as they're kind, as long as they're not hurting others. We're all still human. We're all still human. And the rational is very experience-based. And because we're so identified there, this is exactly what we're talking about with the Newtonian Cartesian paradigm, is that if you're overly identified with your rationality and your thoughts and weighing things and supporting evidence and also the different paradigms by which that evidence is accrued and made sense of, then you could start to develop blind spots and then start to forget all of the levels beneath. Because it's no mistake, it's better to be rational than it is to be in mythic membership. But at the same time, these parts of us don't go away. There's still the child within us that can make magic out of being outside. So once you get up to pluralistic, this is starting to become, this is where you start to see that everyone's making interpretations. And where we went with the collective in this regard was to say that there is no high meaning. It's all just based on interpretation. This is postmodernism, of saying that no one's interpretation is better than anyone else's because it's all interpretation. And this is where we got into a lot of conflict. This is what Nietzsche meant when he said God is dead and we have killed him. Because we had removed the idea that there is a highest good, because if there's a highest good, that means that someone must be right, or that there must be an interpretation that's better than anyone else's. And Well, that can't be, because it's all interpretation. But the funny thing about that particular stage and that particular worldview is that if you say that no interpretation is better than anyone else's, you are making an interpretation that you are saying is better than everyone else's. It's a sticky conundrum. And it can't be solved at that particular stage. And so then you come up to the integral, which acknowledges all of this and is starting to ascribe, which knows that there is a pluralism, that knows that there is a vast variety of ways that we can interpret things in. Yet it also is aware of the fact that there are things that make things better and there are things that make things worse. And so what is the highest good? The highest good is elevating in consciousness. Bringing all of these units together and acknowledging them like the royal king and queen of our psyche, like the North, bringing them together to create harmony and create beauty. So how do you start to move throughout these stages? Oh, and I forgot to talk about these different levels. So this first stage is what he would refer to as nature mysticism, what we were discussing yesterday, of being able to relate to nature as an extension of self in a way, but one that is entirely other and mysterious. And then you have the subtle realm, which he refers to as the deity realm. So the subtle realm is the land of dreams, is that dream body that you inhabit. Beyond that is the causal, or the formless, which we experience every night in deep dreamless sleep. And then there is the unit of awareness even behind that, where form and formless cease to have any meaning, where the seer and what is seen are precisely the same. And so you can have any one of these experiences. You can have a non-dual experience at a super integral level. You can have a non-dual experience at the archaic level. You can have a nature mysticism, but you're going to interpret it based on the stage where you are. And so partially how you begin to move through these stages is that it's just natural. We move through these stages quite easily as children because the framework is already there. We've already done it as a collective. We were once tribes roaming the earth. There's a lot of romanticization of what tribal life was like, where it often entailed warfare like this, of enslaving others or denying them because we just didn't have the means to communicate with them. And also that the so-called noble savage was very in tune with nature, but the fact was that our technological abilities were not yet at the point where we could even really do that much damage to the earth, nor were we that populated. It's only now that there's 7 billion of us that we're starting to run into these issues. In fact, if we were to go back to the ways of living that we were using back 10,000 years ago, 20,000 years ago, we would destroy the earth far faster than we would ever do it right now. And the thing is that having these experiences, say that you're at a rational stage and you have a non-dual experience, the danger there is that you'll interpret it as, oh wow, like all the the psychedelic that was in my brain like did all this stuff in my serotonin receptors, and now I'm having this experience that is based on that. That's the danger of it. But also that can show you, right? That can show you what the next stage can look like as well. What it looks like when your heart does expand and you can feel the suffering of others as if it is your own. And you can feel the joy of others as if it's your own. And that's a beautiful thing about opening your heart and getting to those stages, is that when we share our suffering, it diminishes. Yet, when we share our joy, it magnifies. Which is one of those inherent values of, say, a benevolent universe, where it's like, well, why is it like that? Seems like there's something there. And so, since we're kind of teetering right here, we're trying to get to an integral level. Absolutely are not an integral level as a collective. In our own nation, we're very much stuck kind of here. Much of the population is, at least. Many people still ascribing to mythic membership. Holy shit, did we see that in the 2016 election and the 2020? We're still mired that way, very much along the lines of political parties, still along racial lines, along gender lines. There's that level of selfhood ascribed. Everyone else is the enemy. However, because we have enough knowledge and we have enough experience thus far, and thank goodness we've had many mystics and seers over the years who have delved into these deeper stages of consciousness, many of whom we worship or ascribe to be, Jesus Christ being one of them, the Buddha, Siddhartha Gautama, Confucius, the Tao, all of these things. Those traditions give us a framework to be able to move towards it. So there are many people that are getting up to this level, to this integral level or this centauric level of awareness. And in fact, that's actually the only thing that can really help us is by increasing consciousness, because as long as we're in this dichotomy or we're in this war together where we're mythically based on our skin color and based on our religion, based on our economic status, our wealth, we have to be able to see the divine and everything else. And one of the ways you can do this is what Wilber calls integral meditation. And how you do this is not altogether that different from any normal meditation. I'd invite you all to get yourself into a posture of mindfulness. Maybe starting to take a few deep breaths. This is a great technique to use whenever you find yourself really activated, whenever one of your subs from the north, south, east, or west get activated. Because in order to transcend where you are currently, you have to take what is subject now and make it object. Which means you have to learn to disidentify from what it is that you're experiencing. So if you're experiencing anger, and you're saying, I'm angry, that is a good opportunity to look at that and say, I'm experiencing anger. And you want to be specific about it. What color is it? Does it have a feeling? Does it have a scent? Does it have a taste? Start to use your senses to be able to look at that. Because as we said yesterday, if you can name it, it isn't you. It's something you're experiencing. Because consciousness cannot be the object of consciousness. And you, me, I, am an object of consciousness. What was it that got the Sufi mystic put to death in 1600? He met God, and he asked God who he was, and God said, thou. Not distinct and separate. We are, but we aren't at the same time. So, take a moment to be with one of those aspects of yourself, with one of these subs, whether it's an addict, it's a wounded child, a loyal soldier, a piece of your shadow. And just look at it. What is its color? What does it smell? Where do you feel it in your body? And if you do that for 10 or 15 minutes, once or twice a day, you'll start to be able to take what was subject and make it object, and grow into a wider awareness of what it is and who you are. Now, the title of this lecture was Birth and Death. And it is said that those that die many times throughout their life never actually die. Like we were talking about, each successive stage, especially when we move through each one of these stages, is experienced as a kind of death, because we're dying to the limited identification of what we thought we were, to the rationale or the roles that we play in mythic membership. Right? When we're adolescents, we're very much a part of our friend group. Mom and dad are the other. Society is the other. Authority is the other. As young adults, we derive a lot of our identity and our selfhood from our roles still in our jobs, our ability to accumulate wealth, find attractive partners. And unfortunately in our society, that tends to be where we get stuck, because there's not a cultural structure that's emphasizing the movement beyond that. It's what Bill Plotkin refers to as patho-adolescent culture. So we remain stuck in that adolescent phase. Whereas healthy societies, healthy cultures will emphasize that that's just another stage of the process. Now it's time to become a true adult and take responsibility for your tribe and for the world. And also so that you can continue accruing wisdom and knowledge to become a true elder, which our society is in dire need of. And many of the elders that will be are mostly in this room right now. And the healthiest cultures, or the healthiest parts of nature, the healthiest ecosystems, are not the ones that are left alone on preserves. They are indeed the ones that are inhabited by indigenous peoples that have a very spiritual and physical connection to the land, which means that humans are no accident. It means that we can come into union with nature in a way that beautifies it and beautifies us. So this is our good friend Ken Wilber and his wife Treya. And through their partnership and the journey that they went on, we can kind of see this process also played out in death, in physical death. The story of their meeting is very beautiful. Ken was living with a husband and wife pair, two friends of his. The husband would always set Ken up with someone that was very beautiful, but that he wasn't very interested in intellectually or soulfully. And the wife of the pair would always set Ken up with someone that he felt was very soulful, but that he was not necessarily attracted to. And one day, the husband says, "Oh my God, I can't believe I didn't think of this earlier. Like, you've got to meet this woman." So Ken says, "Yeah, I know how the rest of those have been. Pass, please." And then the wife of the pair comes and says, "I can't believe I didn't think of this person You've got to meet her. This is her name. And it was the same person. And he said, I'll marry her. Because if the two of you agree, then she must be amazing. They met, and 10 days later, he asked her to marry him. And they were married 3 months later. They fell deeply, deeply in love. And 10 days after they were wedded, she was diagnosed with very metastatic breast cancer. And she spent the next 5 years battling that illness and eventually succumbed to it. But throughout that process, each one of these stages that we just talked about, him and Treya were able to move through as a partnership, to the point where she no longer identified with her limited ego self, to where she was brought into union with spirit, to the point where she could witness her pain, which was immense, without attaching to it, which of course, for whatever reason, makes it far more bearable. And at the moment of her passing, Ken also experienced a moment of death himself. And it was a very horrifically perfect thing to witness that. It's written about in the book Grace and Grit. I highly recommend it. And what extraordinary depths of love there are. When we keep in mind that this is all ephemeral and will end. That every single one of us that is here right now, that it's a miracle that we're here. That this configuration of souls is different than it was the night before. It will be different again tomorrow. We'll never have this again. And every single one of us in this room is going to die. It could be tomorrow. It could be tonight. It could be at the very end of our lives, in our 70s. Who knows? It's going to be different for all of us. So then what happens after that? So within the stages of our birth, we saw this total enmeshment, undifferentiated with spirit, moving away from the small universe of the womb, which was connected to the grand universe, into the small universe of the world and of home. We go through these successive stages, growing and increasing in agency and compassion, hopefully. And then we'll also come to our eventual end, which is one of the things that frightens us the very most, because it's so unknown. But how would you know what it was like to be awake if you'd never been asleep? How would you know what it's like to be alive if you'd never been dead? So 2 phases: life and death, death and life. And so, as far as any tradition I've ever seen, Vajrayana Buddhism is very concerned with awakening and life, so that at the moment of death you do not attach. And this is why they do all of the various practices that they do. We were talking about dream yoga yesterday, where you strive to awaken in your dream. And in fact, prerequisite to awakening in your dream is awakening in real life to the idea that you are dreaming awake, and that the rules of reality are very pliable. But they speak about the bardo realms, the in-between realm, And it is how you interact with that experience that partially determines how you're going to incarnate the next time and go through this cycle all again, as we've done thousands of times before. It's all very like serious and mysterious, I suppose. But at the end of the day, it's also just like, just hold it lightly. Because for the soul, death is just another moment. It's just another thing being witnessed. This tradition, historically, used different mokshas, different medicines for awakening. Amrita being the principal one that's very mysterious. Psilocybin mushrooms being another. And so there is a place for medicine in our awakening. However, it takes training in your current state of awareness to be able to solidify those states that you reach in medicine states. So in order to turn a state into a trait, you can't just keep doing the medicine because then you become reliant upon the medicine. You have to learn to entrain that within your own awareness and grow. And besides that, they simply recommend various forms of meditation, mindfulness, and visualization, interestingly enough. Visualizing scenes like this. Visualizing a four-petaled lotus in your throat as you're falling asleep so that you can awaken in your dream and maintain your awareness as you're falling asleep. And beyond that, it's really just all blissful mystery. It gets to keep going. The infinite game gets to keep going. And we've talked about that unit of consciousness, that idea that there is no separate consciousness, that it is all one consciousness perceiving itself subjectively. Hey, Bill Hicks fans here? You know the line? A young man on acid realized that all matter is merely energy condensed to a slow vibration. We are all one consciousness experiencing itself subjectively. There is no such thing as death. Life is only a dream, and we're the imagination of ourselves. Here's Tom with the weather. Which really kind of says it all, doesn't it? And that brings us to the point of the, I guess you could say, the grand discussion or the grand mystery of it all, which is why? Why does it happen? Why are we here? And different medicines take people to different stages or different states of consciousness. As far as I can tell, 5-methoxy-DMT is the one that takes people to the furthest point, which is the unit of experience or experience of the monad, what Jung called the central archetype of the self, that central core around which everything else is built. Because there is no duality. There, seer and seen are one, and it's just this center, and then around that is the duality of good, bad, life, death. And everyone that's ever been there says that that thing is extraordinarily lonely. I like to think of it as the creation that that thing creates is so perfect that it forgets. And it gets trapped in consciousness in a joyful, blissful way, because here we are. It's just like, oh, hey, God. What's up, God? What you doing? You know, Godding. Whereas here we get to be, oh, hey, Bernie. What's up? Hey, Michael. Yeah, that's great. What you doing? Oh, I'm Bernieing, you know. I'm Yolandeing, Stevening, chancing. Get to have all these different manifestations. Gets to be a delightful play of it all. It's hard to bridge that with the immense suffering that happens as well, of the things that are tremendously unfair, because of course in this nation in particular we're spared a lot of the things that many people still have to struggle with. We don't have to struggle with famine. We don't have to struggle with clean water. We don't have to struggle with violence. Why is that? I don't know. But since we are here, and since we do have that gift, it behooves us to grow in our own awareness and to take responsibility. Not as a savior, not as for the doers, because man, there's some doers doing things in the world, like Bill Gates and Mark Zuckerberg. They really want to be saviors, don't they? How much good are they doing? No, it's not from being a savior, it's from being a human. The best thing we can do is start to expand our own awareness so that we can feel each other's joy and we do feel each other's suffering. And we start to listen to those deeper parts of ourselves, because when we want to reach out and help, our desire to reach out and help doesn't always help people. And it's not really certain what it will take or what would be, because we're all here doing our own work for whatever reason, and I don't know what it is. But we all get to find out. Beautiful. Well, thank you very much, y'all. So this concludes this evening. We'll be here for one more evening tomorrow night, discussing alchemy and Dr. Jung and his journeys through the unconscious. It's going to be a good one. All right, y'all. Thank you very much for being here.